Okay, so the first story is all about what is being called phase four of the coronavirus or COVID 19 relief. And my basic idea here is that green energy mandates would be a death blow to economic recovery. So, just for a little background on the story. Oops. So, I mean, the background. This is as I see it. It's not always described this way, but the policies that we have right now, what I call universal isolation policies, these are destroying the productive ability of tens of millions of Americans, and in a significant way, hundreds of millions of Americans. I mean, the majority of the country. And so you see different kinds of headlines here, and you've probably heard about just record unemployment filings, and just walking around anywhere, you're going to see a massive increase in homelessness and hopelessness, for that matter. So there's a question of are we having the right policies? I would say no, and I'll describe. I've described in the past what I think is wrong about our policies and why, at the very least, any isolation policies should be much more selective and targeted. But in any case, there's still the question of, okay, even if this was necessary, what do we do? What do we do to make up for it? Because we have people's livelihoods just being completely compromised right now, and in many cases even destroyed. So there's a lot of things we can say about what should be done. I think in general, the goal should be let people be productive again as soon as possible and make up for any kinds of, insofar as is possible, any sorts of destruction of productivity. I think the extent to which you can make up for that is very limited, because you can't just, like, time lost is time lost. So I think there are limits to how effective policies can be. But I think there are two things we should definitely not do that should be obvious, but unfortunately policymakers are not treating these as obvious. So one is, we definitely don't want to do anything that further destroys American productivity. Our productivity is just taking such a massive hit, particularly anyone whose productivity involves in-person interaction, and to some degree or another, that's just about everyone. And then the second is, we definitely don't want to do anything that raises consumer prices, because people are much poorer right now. And so they definitely don't need higher consumer prices. Now, unfortunately, one of the leading policies on the table is green energy. And you'll hear different kinds of policies like wind production tax credit. But the broad idea around all of these is, now is the time to mandate green energy, and in particular, solar and wind energy. And I think this is exactly the wrong policy, because it's going to do something that is going to do exactly the two things we want to avoid. It's going to make us less productive, and it's going to increase prices. And that is making energy more expensive. So the fundamental thing is, if you mandate unreliable wind and solar energy, you're going to make energy much more expensive. You're going to make us less productive. And you're going to make consumer prices go up. So I've talked about this issue many times, but here's a new graphic that my colleague Stefan Henna, happens to be from Germany. This is actually of Germany. And so he's showing a situation that captures what's wrong with trying to rely on unreliable fuel sources like solar and wind. And this is in Germany, where there's been a huge, what they would call investment in solar and wind. And as we'll see, has come at just on its own massive cost to people throughout the country. And what you see is, sometimes you'll see, so if you look at the upper right, you'll see, oh, wow, wind and solar, in terms of electricity, that's not all of energy, because most of their energy is for transportation, fuel, and heating, and other uses that aren't electricity. Also, industrial heat and home heat are included under heating. But you still have here electricity. It's pretty impressive. Wind and solar are delivering 90% of the load. So you'll see a news story that says, oh, wind and solar 90%, isn't that great? But what they don't show you is, in the middle, you can see, oh, wow, just within a 24-hour period. So one was on April 5th, and then the other's on April 4th, the night before. Wind and solar are 6% of the load. So it's almost going down to 0% just of the electricity. So here's a question. Actually, before I get to the question, I'll just make this point, that when you're thinking of the cost of solar and wind, you have to recognize that it's unreliable. So the infrastructure you have to pay for you not only have to pay for the unreliable energy infrastructure, so the solar panels, the wind turbines, the transmission lines, and then all the mining and manufacturing and transportation that goes into those, but you also need a reliable energy infrastructure. In Germany's case, particularly because they're anti-nuclear, which we'll talk more about soon, you have lost my train of thought for 1 second. So you have substantially coal, gas, other reliable forms of energy. On other grids, it's a lot of nuclear. In Germany, still quite a bit of nuclear, but they're trying to phase it out. So whenever you think about the cost, it's always the cost of the unreliable energy infrastructure plus the reliable energy infrastructure. Now, here's a simple math problem that most people aren't aware of. So which costs more? Having just a 100% reliable energy infrastructure with things like coal, gas, and nuclear, or having that same infrastructure plus the unreliable energy infrastructure? And the answer is it costs a lot more to have both infrastructures, and it's incredibly duplicative. Now you can say, oh, we're going to save a lot of money on fuel because the fuel comes from the sun and the wind. But a couple problems there. One is that nuclear, coal, gas aren't very high in cost in terms of the fuel. And the other thing is that because the unreliables require a huge degree of reliable use, they are always going to use a lot of fuel. But not only that, they require the fuel to go up and down. So if we go back to here, like you can see that it's going up and down and up and down. And this is just in a day. This is happening throughout the year and through seasons and stuff. And when you cycle an engine up and down, it becomes much less efficient. This is why when you drive in stop and go traffic, your engine is much less efficient. So what happens is not only do you have to pay for this extra infrastructure, but you have to use the fossil fuels really inefficiently. And so what happens is overall the cost just goes up. So Germany, they're getting 10% of their overall energy from less than 10% overall from solar and wind, and yet their electricity prices have been doubling in the past couple decades since they started these initiatives. So, and if you try to scale it up even more, it becomes even more duplicative and you get more problems. And then if you try to cut back on the reliables, then you run into huge reliability problems because you need electricity when you don't have electricity. So you're talking about some combination of prices going way up and reliability going down. Now, as I've talked about, this is really bad for productivity, which is one of the things we need to be really concerned about because it's already being destroyed by the whole coronavirus response. And so there's just this general truth that the higher cost energy is, the higher cost everything is. And it's because the higher cost energy is, and we'll focus on American energy here because we're talking about American policies, the less productive and competitive American industry will be. So for example, here's a story about Australian aluminum smelters are not sustainable due to high power costs. So they are mandating what I call unreliable solar and wind. Then their energy prices go up and then they're not competitive with other countries. So, I mean, just think about it. This is the last thing we want right now. We have people in this country who they have productive jobs. And in many cases, they're not allowed to go to those jobs because of fear of virus transmission. And then we're saying, oh, on top of that, we're going to jack up your energy costs so that producing something here is even more expensive than it is in other countries. And then at the same time, if that's not bad enough, the cost of energy, raising that is going to make the cost of all the different goods go up. So, you have these different kinds of stories about places that are mandating unreliables, mandating green energy. They're having high costs in everything, not just energy bills, but even things like food bills, because a huge amount of food is the energy cost. As I will often use the expression, fossil fuels are the food of food. And you need, we modern agriculture relies on machine power, and machine power relies on machine calories, which both power the machines and then they are used themselves to make the machines. They power other machines that make the machines. And so anytime you raise the cost of energy, you raise the cost of machine power, which means you raise the cost of everything. So when you hear about these proposals, oh, let's have more clean energy, let's have more green energy, what they're saying is let's take another massive hit to productivity. let's make America even poorer. And it's worth saying most countries are not going to be dumb enough to do this. And we're already seeing this even before all the COVID issues, where Japan announced that it's going to use a lot more coal plants, in part because it's shutting down nuclear. And then China, it just keeps building more and more and more coal plants every year. And the reason is that is the low cost, reliable energy source for them. And most of the time, in most places, fossil fuels are by far the lowest cost way to produce reliable energy. And so people are generally going to use that. And if you're thinking about, well, I want to see emissions go down around the world, well, you have to recognize that that's not going to happen until and unless lower carbon energy is actually lower cost. And so what you should think about is what kinds of policies can actually make lower carbon energy lower cost. And I think there's above all one thing that we should be focused on. And it's not saying, oh, we need to use the sun and the wind for some reason because they're, quote, renewable. There's no reason to restrict yourself if your concern is CO2 emissions. I think the number one thing should be, let's decriminalize nuclear energy. Nuclear energy, that is a reliable source of energy. It doesn't have the same unreliability problems that solar and wind do. It's currently more expensive than fossil fuels in most places, but it's not incredibly more expensive. So you have France and Sweden have a lot of nuclear, and they have way cheaper electricity prices than Germany. And if we decriminalized it, which means we get rid of a lot of irrational regulations that treat nuclear as much more dangerous than it is, then it's very possible it could become cost competitive. And you should have the same mentality with things like natural gas. Let's remove restrictions on natural gas that prevent it, that if we remove them, it can become even more competitive, particularly around the world, including places where you can transport it using things like liquefied natural gas / LNG. But if you care about reducing emissions, the whole thing has to be, how do we make lower carbon energy lower cost? If you think that you're just going to make higher carbon energy high cost for us, and then everyone else is going to accept huge costs on them, that wasn't happening even when the world felt rich 2 months ago. It's definitely not happening now. You're seeing in Europe, people are starting to abandon some of these green promises, which they weren't meeting anyway. So you really have to recognize the reality that no, the only way emissions are going to go down, and we could talk about to what extent that's a priority. I've talked about, I don't think that's at all the highest priority. I do believe that emissions do have a warming influence on climate, but I don't think it's at all a catastrophic influence. And I think it's much more important that 8 billion people get empowered by low cost energy, including the 3 billion who have virtually none of it. I think that's much more important than controlling the exact amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. But in any case, the only way to get lower carbon energy worldwide is going to be making lower carbon energy cheap. And yet, what happens in terms of nuclear, the most promising form of lower carbon energy, it is massively opposed by many of the advocates of the Green New Deal. So we had Elizabeth Warren against them, Bernie Sanders against them. He just dropped out of the race. But Joe Biden has been lukewarm at best. And when something is criminalized and needs to be decriminalized, it's not enough to be lukewarm about it. You need to champion it. So any politician that claims to care about lowering emissions, one of the litmus tests is, are they supporting nuclear energy? And if in terms of the recovery, the whole focus should be, let's decriminalize good things that are being irrationally restricted. That needs to be happening in healthcare, and it's starting to happen because of all these irrational restrictions that have made it a lot harder to fight COVID-19 than it should be, including all the crazy restrictions on testing that have just left us completely flat-footed. And in general, what we should be looking for is, hey, let's get out of this by making ourselves an even freer country, not let's get out of this by making ourselves an even more restricted country. So that is the first story of the day.